There is a clay tablet in a museum right now that explains in amazing detail what happens to the human soul after death. Not as a metaphor, not as a symbol, step by step, stage by stage, with the kind of detail that makes you wonder how anyone in 3000 BCE could have written it without being there themselves. The tablet is Sumerian. It is thousands of years older than the Bible. Hidden inside its cuneiform text is something scholars have mostly avoided talking about in mainstream academia. It is a description of death not as an ending, but as a process, a transition that includes stages, gatekeepers, a destination, and, most disturbingly, a system by which human souls are recycled into new bodies with no memory of what came before. The Sumerians called it the fate that was designed for humanity. According to the tablet, it was not designed by nature. It was designed by someone else entirely. If you have never heard of this before, there is a reason. The academic world tends to treat these texts as mythology, as the simple spiritual beliefs of a primitive people. But what happens when you remove that assumption and read the tablets for exactly what they say? What you find changes everything. Subscribe if you want more like this. This covers the history they did not teach you in school. New video every week. Now let's get into it. The story begins in the Cradle of Civilization itself, Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. About 6,000 years ago, in the region that is now southern Iraq, something amazing happened. A civilization appeared with almost no archaeological lead-up, no slow build-up, no gradual progress from simple tools to complex buildings. The Sumerians arrived with agriculture, writing, math, astronomy, law, architecture, and a detailed understanding of the universe that modern scholars are still trying to fully decode. Conventional archaeology has spent decades trying to explain this. The answers are never fully satisfying. The Sumerians themselves had a very clear explanation for where their knowledge came from. And that explanation involves beings they called the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki translates roughly as those who came from the heavens to earth. In some interpretations, it means those of royal blood who came down. The Sumerians described them not as gods in the religious sense, but as physical beings, advanced, powerful, able to do things that ordinary humans could not. They flew in objects the Sumerians called vehicles of heaven. They used weapons that destroyed with fire and sound, and according to the creation texts, they created humanity itself for a specific purpose. This is not a fringe interpretation. This is what the tablets actually say. The most complete version of the Sumerian creation story comes from texts called the Enuma Elish, combined with the Atrahasis epic and different cylinder seal inscriptions. Taken together, they describe a situation in which the Anunnaki came to Earth long before humans existed. They began mining operations, mainly for gold. After thousands of years, the lower-ranking Anunnaki workers grew tired and began to revolt. The solution suggested by the Anunnaki leader Enki and his half-sister Ninmah was to create a new kind of worker, a being able to do the labor so the Anunnaki would not have to. That being was called the Lulu, the mixed one. It was created by combining the genetic material of the Anunnaki with the primitive beings already living on Earth. You can see the echo of this story in Genesis, in the Vedic texts, in the Book of Enoch, and in the oral traditions of many cultures across the ancient world. The story appears in too many places with too many matching details to be just a coincidence. But the Sumerians wrote it down first, and they wrote it with technical detail that later versions completely lost. What the Sumerians described was not magic. It was genetic engineering, and the soul was part of the design. To understand what the tablets say about death, you first need to understand what the Sumerians believed a human being actually was. Their model of the human being is very different from what modern Western thinking assumes. In Sumerian cosmology, the human being was a composite being. It was not just a body with a soul, it was a construction made of several different layers, and each of those layers behaved differently at death. The physical body was called the balag. It was made of clay, which, in Sumerian creation texts, is clearly described as a mixture of earth and divine blood. When the body died, it returned to the earth. Simple. But there were other parts that did not return to the earth. The Sumerians used several terms for the non-physical parts of the human being. The most commonly discussed is the gaidim, often translated as ghost or shade. The important point is this: the gaidim is the part of the human being that survives physical death and goes through the process the tablets describe. There is also the me, a term that appears throughout Sumerian religious texts and is hard to translate easily. The me refers to something like divine qualities or basic programs that control the behavior of gods, humans, and the universe itself. The me were described as physical objects that could be held, stolen, moved, and controlled. Enki was said to possess the me of all things. One of the most important me in the Sumerian system was the me of death itself. The Sumerians did not understand death as a natural event. They understood it as a system, a designed process with rules and mechanics. Those mechanics are laid out in clear recoverable detail in a text known today as the Descent of Inanna into the Underworld. Inanna was the Sumerian goddess of love, war, and the heavens, one of the most powerful figures in the Anunnaki hierarchy. The story of her descent into the underworld is one of the oldest written stories in human history, older than Homer by more than 2,000 years. While modern scholars have spent a lot of energy studying it as mythology, a different reading appears when you take the text completely literally. The underworld in this text is called Kur, sometimes translated as the Great Below. It is described not as an abstract spiritual place, but as a physical location. It has walls, it has gates, it has administrators. It works according to specific laws. The most important detail, the one that changes everything about how you read this story, is this: the beings in the underworld do not know they are there. That line appears in different translations of several tablets. The dead live in a realm that works like a kind of holding area. They continue. They experience something like awareness, but they are not fully conscious of their situation. They are not free. The story of Inanna's descent describes her journey through 7 gates. At each gate, something is taken from her: a piece of clothing, a piece of jewelry, a symbol of power and identity. By the time she reaches the final gate, she has nothing left. She arrives in the Great Below, stripped of everything that made her who she was. Scholars interpret this symbolically as the stripping away of ego and a spiritual death before rebirth. But think about another interpretation. What if the 7 gates are a description of a real process? What if what is being stripped away at each stage is not symbolic clothing, but real layers of consciousness, memory, and identity? What if the Descent of Inanna is not a symbolic poem, but an instruction manual written by beings who knew exactly how the system worked because they built it? That interpretation sounds extreme until you start comparing texts. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes a process of breaking down that happens after death. Consciousness passes through stages. At each stage, something is met and something is released. By the time the process is complete, the original identity has been broken down enough that the soul no longer remembers who it was. It is then guided back into rebirth. The Egyptian Book of the Dead describes a hall of 2 truths where the soul is judged, a weighing of the heart. The soul either passes or is consumed. If consumed, it is described not as destroyed, but as taken apart and returned to the cycle. The Vedic texts describe samsara, the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth kept going by forces outside the individual soul's control. Freedom from samsara is described as extremely hard to achieve. The obstacles to freedom are described in language that sounds a lot like deliberate obstruction. The Gnostic texts, many hidden for centuries before the Nag Hammadi discovery in 1945, describe archons, beings that keep control over the material world and the cycle of souls. The Gnostics believed that human souls were divine sparks trapped in a system designed to keep them recycling forever. The material world itself was described as a prison made by a lower god, a demiurge who had fooled humanity into believing this world was all there was. Now, put all of that together and place it next to what the Sumerian tablets say. The tablets describe a human being as a created being, designed and engineered, built with specific parts. One of those parts is the gaidim, the surviving consciousness that lasts beyond the death of the body. According to the Sumerian system, the gaidim is not free after death. it travels to Kur, the great below, where it is held, where its memory and identity are broken down, and where it waits until it is sent back into the cycle. The Sumerians did not present this as metaphysics, they presented it as engineering. This raises the question that ancient astronaut researchers have been asking for decades, and that mainstream academia refuses to take seriously. If the Anunnaki designed the human being, and if the Anunnaki designed the process by which human souls cycle after death, what was the purpose of that design? The answer the tablets suggest is not comforting. If that is true, then the soul recycling system described in the tablets takes on a completely different meaning. A labor force that died would need to be replaced. If the soul is a part that can be recycled into a new body with its memory erased, then you never really lose the worker. You just reset them and put them back into the system. The trap is that the soul does not know this is happening. Inanna at the seventh gate has nothing left. She does not remember who she was. She does not remember what she knew. She does not remember that there is another option. And so, when she is sent back, when the cycle begins again, she takes part in her own recycling. Not because she chooses to, but because the choice was taken from her at the seventh gate. This is the trap the tablets describe. And the reason it works is that the mechanism for breaking down memory and identity is built into the dying process itself. You do not have to be forced into the cycle, you only have to fail to escape it before the gates strip you down far enough that you no longer remember you wanted to. The question that naturally follows from this is whether there is a way out. The tablets, together with other ancient texts, do describe something like an escape route, but they describe it in terms that should concern anyone paying attention. Escape from the cycle requires preparation. It requires knowledge. It requires that you keep a specific kind of awareness during the dying process, especially at the gates, where the pressure to let go of identity and memory is strongest. The traditions that describe this in the most detail are not the ones that ended up in Sunday school. The Tibetan tradition calls this the recognition of the clear light of death. The moment right after physical awareness dissolves, when the original nature of consciousness is briefly visible before the process of breakdown begins. If that moment is recognized, if the dying person can keep awareness through it without being carried away, the cycle can be broken. The Gnostic tradition calls it gnosis, not knowledge in the school sense, but direct personal recognition of the soul's true nature. The Gnostics believed that this knowledge was deliberately hidden, that the system, the archons, the demiurge, and its enforcers actively worked to make sure that human beings died in ignorance and therefore returned to the cycle without resistance. The Egyptian tradition hid similar knowledge in the Book of the Dead, which is more accurately translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day. That text was designed not to tell the story of death, but to give the soul practical instructions for moving through the process without losing itself in it. That common source, if you follow the thread back far enough, leads to Sumer. The tablets go further than just describing the soul recycling system. They describe the gatekeepers, the beings who manage the process, and their descriptions are detailed enough to be unsettling. In The Descent of Inanna, the gatekeeper of the first gate is called Niti. He receives Inanna, asks for her credentials, and enforces the stripping process with complete authority. He does not do this out of cruelty. He does it because this is his function. He is an administrator of a system. In Egyptian cosmology, Anubis plays a similar role. In the Tibetan system, the peaceful and wrathful deities met in the Bardo State Act as gatekeepers, whose job is to test and possibly redirect the consciousness of the dying person. Occam's razor, applied consistently, should make people uncomfortable here. Together, these pieces describe what could be called the architecture of the afterlife in extraordinary technical detail. The Underworld is described as having specific zones. A region near the surface where newly dead souls arrive, still holding some leftover awareness and memory. A middle region where the stripping process happens, managed by beings whose function is clearly described as the removal of attributes. And a deep region called the Land of No Return, which is not a punishment for the wicked, but simply the default destination for all human souls. The phrase Land of No Return is one of the most well-known terms in Sumerian scholarship. It appears across many texts, and it is almost always understood metaphorically. The dead simply do not return to the living. That is the conventional reading. But some researchers argue for a more literal reading. Land of no return does not mean the dead do not return to the physical world. It means the consciousness that reaches the deep underworld does not return to itself. It is not the body that does not come back. It is the memory, the identity, the thread of awareness that would allow the soul to know what it is, what it was, and what is being done to it. The no return is not geographical, it is psychological. It is the point in the process after which the soul cannot recover what it has lost, and therefore cannot resist the recycling mechanism. This is the trap. The tablets describe it with enough detail that you have to wonder very seriously whether whoever wrote them was describing something real, something they knew directly, either because they had been there, which would require a kind of consciousness that could observe the after-death process and report back, or because they had built it. That second possibility is the one that researchers in the ancient astronaut field have been quietly building a case for over the last several decades. We already accept, without controversy, that the Sumerians believed the human body was engineered. The creation texts say this clearly. Humanity was not an accident of evolution. Humanity was a designed product. If the body was designed, why not the soul? And if the soul was designed, the system controlling its behavior after death could have been designed at the same time as a feature, not a side effect. What would the purpose of that feature be? The same purpose as the creation itself. Labor continuity. Making sure that the workforce never truly ran out because the souls were always being recycled back into new bodies. The mining operations described in the Sumerian texts were not short-term projects, they were permanent infrastructure. And permanent infrastructure needs a permanent workforce. But if you are working from the Sumerian framework, the amnesia is not a side effect of biology. It is the whole point. A workforce that remembered being a workforce would be a workforce able to revolt. The Atrahasis epic describes exactly that kind of revolt among the Anunnaki workers before humanity was created. The solution was not to give the new workers better conditions. The solution was to give them a new kind of amnesia. They would not remember their divine origin. They would not remember their past lives. They would not know they were in a cycle. They would simply be born, work, die, be recycled, and be born again forever without ever building up enough continuous awareness to understand their situation, much less resist it. The Gnostics, thousands of years after the Sumerians, were describing exactly this when they wrote about the archonic system. They had reached the same conclusion through a completely different tradition. The soul is trapped. The trap is elegant, and its elegance lies exactly in the fact that the trapped soul does not know it is trapped. There is a word for a system designed to capture and hold something without the captive's awareness of its situation. The word is a cage that looks like freedom. That is what the Sumerian tablets describe. The afterlife is not heaven. It is not hell. It is a processing system, and the processing is happening to you right now in the sense that you are the product of that processing. You are a recycled soul in a new body with no memory of the process that brought you here. Everything that you are, your preferences, your fears, your relationships, your sense of self, was built fresh in this lifetime with no continuity from whatever came before. The tablet does not say this to scare you. The tablet is not concerned with your reaction. It is documentation. It was written by beings who understood the system either because they experienced it, observed it, or built it. The question of what to do with that information is exactly where the ancient esoteric traditions take over, because they all agree on one thing. The trap can be identified, and something that can be identified can possibly be avoided. The preparation needed is not complex in description, but it is described as extremely difficult in practice. It requires that a person develop during physical life the kind of continuous awareness that the dying process tries to put out. The traditions call this by different names: presence, wakefulness, witness consciousness, the clear, direct awareness of the original mind before thought, before identity, before the structures of personality that the gates will try to strip away. The reason you develop this awareness during life is not because life is where the tests happen. Life is the training ground. Death is where the exam happens. The 7 gates of the Sumerian underworld, each removing one more layer of the self, can only be passed by a consciousness that does not identify with the layers being removed. If you are your memories, the loss of memory destroys you. If you are your identity, the breaking down of identity leaves nothing. But if behind all of that there is something that simply watches, that does not cling to what is being taken, then that something, the witness, can pass through the 7th gate with awareness still intact. That is what Inanna does. She gives up at each gate willingly. She does not fight the process. She does not try to hold on to what is being taken. She moves through all 7 gates naked, stripped of everything, and she survives. Most souls do not do this because most souls do not know it is necessary. They arrive at the first gate with their full personality still intact, resist the stripping, and fail. The gate is stronger than the resistance. The awareness that should remain as the witness gets trapped in the struggle and is swept away with everything else. By the 7th gate, there is nothing left to observe the process, and so the recycling happens without oversight. That is not a small thing. The tablet that sits in the museum right now, written in cuneiform that most people will never read, describes a system, not a belief, not a hope, not a fear. A system with parts, administrators, stages, and a mechanism that processes human consciousness after death and returns it to the physical world with all important memories removed. The Sumerians did not call this God's plan. They called it the fate that was designed for humanity. The word designed is not symbolic. It is the same word used in the creation texts to describe the engineering of the human body. The same word used in the texts about the me, the basic programs that control the behavior of things in the universe. The fate of humanity was designed. The Sumerians recorded who designed it. And the being they named is the same being their texts describe as having created humanity in the first place. Enki, the genetic engineer, the lord of the deep waters, the one whose symbol is the double helix, recognized today as the structure of DNA. Enki is described in different tablets as both humanity's creator and humanity's defender. Within the Anunnaki hierarchy, there are texts that show Enki warning certain humans about coming floods and sharing forbidden knowledge with human initiates. If the trap was built under the instruction of the Anunnaki hierarchy, and if Enki also gave the key to escaping it to chosen human initiates, then the mystery school traditions are the survival instructions written by the same engineer who built the cage. That may be the most important sentence in this entire documentary. This is why the knowledge was secret. Not because knowledge itself is sacred, but because someone with the power to enforce secrecy wanted it kept that way. The tablet describes the trap. The mystery traditions describe the exit, and both the description of the trap and the description of the exit point to the same origin. Sumer, 6,000 years ago, in the clay valleys between 2 rivers, where someone or something sat down with a stylus and a block of clay and wrote down the truth about what happens to human beings when they die. Most people will live their whole lives without knowing this tablet exists. Most people who learn it exists will dismiss it as ancient mythology. Some will read the tablet for what it says and sit with the discomfort of taking it seriously. The tablet does not care which group you fall into. It was not written for the masses. It was written, the evidence suggests, for the few, for those who could read it, understand it, and do something useful with the information before the 7th gate comes for them. The question the tablet leaves you with is not whether the soul survives death. It takes that as a given. The question the tablet leaves you with is whether the soul that survives death is still clearly you. Whether the awareness that passes through the process keeps enough of itself to know what is happening, to recognize the gates for what they are, to let go without losing the one thing that cannot be replaced. The Sumerians had a word for a human being who had achieved the preparation needed to move through death consciously. It appears in the most sacred parts of the tablets. It means roughly one who knows the way of the descent, not one who died well in an ordinary human sense, not one who was virtuous, not one who pleased the gods, one who knows the way. The knowledge is still available. It is encoded in texts that have survived precisely because someone valued them enough to hide them, copy them, encrypt them, and pass them across thousands of years to the present moment. The Sumerian tablets, the Egyptian funerary texts, the Tibetan Bardo teachings, the Nag Hammadi library, the encoded architecture of sacred sites built with measurements that only make sense if you know what the builders were measuring. All of it points here, to this moment, to the question of what you are going to do with the information your civilization has been shaped to keep you from finding. The clay tablet is still in the museum. The cuneiform is still readable. The system is still running. And somewhere between the first gate and the seventh, the answer to what makes you you is waiting to be found before it is taken away.